diplomacy of the Civil War. Almost always a question about the diplomacy, which means that you've got to sort of know Antietam. You have to know the geography enough so that you can pick out a border state if you have to. Yeah. You might conceivably be asked something about that complex election of 1860, or even 1864, but 1860, you know, if they really want to be mean, they could ask, you got 4 candidates going in 1860, they could come after you with something like that, although that would be a little twitchy. They ask about internal dissent, so draft riots is, you know, open game. They aren't going to ask you about, you know, I don't think they're going to ask you about the Anaconda Plan. I don't think they're going to ask you about Vicksburg or Gettysburg. Except maybe the Gettysburg Address is always open game. And then later on we'll talk about consequences of the war, but the Reconstruction is part of the consequences of the war. I don't think you're going to have anything about generals in the war or leaders in the war. Like I said, military history is not a subject of interest to AP or College Board. They're interested in causes and consequences and, at best, a turning point here and there. There is that guy on the Test Development Committee who's big into economics. And you can see on your little sheet, those of you who picked it up, of the FRQs, evaluate the impact of the Civil War on the political and economic developments in 2 of the following regions, and then it goes south, north, and west. You know, he's got his name kind of on that one. That one, political and economic developments, that's, you know, got Reconstruction and the economy built into it. Anyway, Reconstruction is a topic that they're definitely going to ask you questions about. The main things you have to look at are, you have to sort of distinguish between presidential and radical Reconstruction. There's a bunch of legislation you need to know. You need to sort of have a handle on Black Reconstruction, just when that period when African Americans get elected to mostly state, but also a little bit of federal offices. Then the end of Reconstruction comes with the Compromise of 1867. Emancipation, you know, you need to know about the Freedmen's Bureau, and you need to know sort of about, you know, kind of the failure of the South to reorganize itself on a new economic system, which means that we're going to go in for sharecropping and crop lien. I'll talk about that. And then finally, after the Compromise of 1877 and what I would call the failure of Reconstruction, other people would say that it's a success, but I find that hard to buy, is the Black Codes Terror, which is greater numbers of people in the House of Representatives than they had before. Remember, you were only counting slaves 3/5 before. If you started counting emancipated slaves one-on-one, then all of a sudden the proportional representation changes, and the South actually gains political power in the government. And this is a very ugly thought for a lot of Republicans, that they're going to win the war, and then they're going to lose, and the political consequence is they're going to lose power. And so that they're interested in putting, and they're also seeing that these people are traitors to the Union. Why are we going to allow traitors to re-enter the Union in greater numbers than before? It doesn't make any sense. So Lincoln's, you know, when 10% of the people, his 10% plan, 10% of the people swear loyalty and, you know, accept the amendments, emancipate slaves and everything, and they're basically back in. The radical Republicans are not going to have any part of this. And while Lincoln's alive, that's the system. And remember, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, I believe he's from Tennessee, he is a Southerner. He is all for the most lenient terms for bringing back the Southern states back into the Union that you can possibly imagine. And he openly speaks out against radical Republicans. He's supposedly a Republican, but he really speaks out on behalf of Democrats. And this is also part of the, the election of 1864 has some interesting twists to it as well. But in any case, Lincoln is assassinated. The mild and gentle plan to allow the Southerners to come back without some punishment goes out the door when Lincoln is assassinated. This is not the way to, engender a lot of, warm feelings of reconciliation when the president gets assassinated after the Civil War is over. So the radical Republicans are in the driver's seat. And the leaders are Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives and Charles Sumner in the Senate. And in case those of you who have forgotten who Charles Sumner is, he's this guy. He was the guy who was beaten to a pulp by Preston Brooks during one of the outbreaks in the Senate. There was very popular illustration that was in your book. These are people who have no love lost with the South, right? So, legislation you might need to know. You need to know the Wade Davis bill. The Wade Davis bill is the radical Reconstruction bill that requires 50% of the people give oaths. They have to acknowledge the 14th Amendment. It basically bans people who were generals in the Confederacy from citizenship and voting at all. So it's going to ban a lot of people from voting, period. And it's against Southerners basically showing up at the polls and voting in numbers. It's passed over Johnson's veto. And as a matter of fact, Andrew Johnson, Vice President of the United States, goes out and speaks openly. He says, this is not the plan that Lincoln wanted. You should not obey it. You should not worry about it. He's basically, you have a vice president who's speaking out against the very plans that the Congress is passing. And they pass it over his veto. So that's 1865, following Lincoln's assassination. Freedmen's Bureau is also something that Johnson vetoes, and the radical Republicans pass that over his veto. This is why Andrew Johnson is so unpopular. They're going to find reasons to impeach him, right? Andrew Johnson, they make an attempt to impeach him. And then the Reconstruction Acts, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which basically says you can't violate the civil rights of an emancipated African American. That doesn't take. We would call this the first Reconstruction, and that one FRQ I gave to my class, some of you, where you compare first Reconstruction with second Reconstruction. The second Reconstruction is civil rights in the 50s and 60s. The ones you absolutely have to know, you don't want to go into an AP U.S. history test without knowing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment emancipates the slaves. Remember, Dred Scott states that slaves are not... basically, Lincoln can issue the Emancipation Proclamation as an emergency war measure. He's at war, and as an emergency war measure, in order to weaken the enemy, he can emancipate slaves, because it will disrupt the Southern economy. He does not have the authority to abolish slavery. It requires a constitutional amendment, but during wartime, during an emergency, extraordinary situation, he can do something to simply disrupt the economy of his enemy. But when the war is over, he's got to pass an amendment to the Constitution to free the slaves, and he does that right away, and Lincoln's around to do that. So 13th Amendment, emancipates slaves. 14th Amendment is civil rights legislation. Basically, Dred Scott, if you remember, said that not only is the guy not going to be free, but since he's an ex-slave, he's not a citizen. The United States never recognized the citizenship of slaves. So 14th Amendment basically states clearly anybody born in the United States is an American citizen. It overrides Dred Scott. It basically says that they're entitled to full rights and liberties of all other citizens. They're entitled to due process. If you accuse them of a crime or you're going to take their property away, they can go before a court and see what the deal is. The 15th Amendment is make sure that, and people are still trying to prevent ex-slaves from voting. The 15th Amendment, remember, the radical Republicans are interested in creating a political base